Elliot Jagniecki is a senior petroleum geologist with the Energy and Minerals Program at the Utah Geological Survey. He worked 5 years at ConocoPhillips in Houston in research and development and exploration prior to joining the Utah Geological Survey in September of 2018. He coordinates research with government, industry, and academic partners on assessing petroleum resources and characterizing Utah's geology. Besides his knowledge in petroleum geology, his expertise includes sedimentology, evaporites, modern and ancient lacustrine systems, and geochemistry. He is actively involved in researching the sedimentary processes, chemical sediments, and brine dynamics in Great Salt Lake, and working with graduate students on the Bonneville Salt Flats. He graduated with a BS in geology from Central Michigan University and received his PhD from I can't even read this.
Binghamton.
Binghamton, I'm sorry.
Binghamton.
Thank you so much. In geology and geochemistry. He's a licensed professional geologist in Utah. Elliot, thank you so much for being here on kind of late notice. I was like, let's do this program. And you were so enthusiastic. And
better now than never. So
yeah, take it away. Thanks for being here.
All right. Share my screen. Yeah, so thank you for having me, Jamie and Bonnie. Let's get this uploaded. Okay. So we've been looking at these mounds since last year in the late fall, and as Jamie said, the park ranger, Allison Thompson, was a very curious park ranger at the state park, and she noticed these mound formations out on the mudflat near the marina that nobody apparently at the marina has ever seen. And I'll dive into that. It's probably due mostly to lake level highs and lows. And I would just want to recognize that working with Mike Vandenberg on this, Mark Milligan's been a really good outreach person, and Christian Hartwick has been our drone expert. Allison Thompson has since gone somewhere else, but Angelique is our new point contact at the state park. And then we have some microbiologists working on this too. Bonnie Baxter, Jamie and Elisa, they're working with the time lapse. And then we have at Montana State, Eric Boyd, and he has some students working on the microbiology and communities. And both Bonnie and Eric are also doing the genomics. So be exciting to see what type of results come out of this. But here are some examples of the pools. Depending on what day of time you go out there and how the light is reflecting off of them, they can be really prismatic and kind of create these infinity pools and very crystalline terraces. So what is Merabolite? It's known as glauber salt, which is just a layman's term. It is a well-known evaporite all over the world. It usually grows at cold temperatures, but it's a sodium sulfate that has 10 waters attached to it. So it's a very hydrated mineral. It's colorless, vitreous, forms in sulfate-rich brines. So Great Salt Lake has a lot of sulfate-rich brines, and typically during the wintertime when it's cold. When temperature warms up, it dehydrates to thenardite, which is basically sodium sulfate, typically above 10 degrees C or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But you can sample this stuff, and if you put it in a Ziploc bag with a sponge, soaked sponge of the brine, you can actually leave it on your table for however long you want, and it's usually stable up to 90 degrees Fahrenheit, as long as the humidity is there. So why is it important? Well, back in the day, it used to be, and I think it still is, used for detergents in wood pulp when people used to make paper. It's a industrial product of soda ash. So that there's a chemical reaction with soda ash, which is sodium carbonate, used in textiles, glass industry. It became well known during traditional Chinese medicine as a laxative. So I brought my dog out there a couple of months ago, and he just talk about poop. He cleansed himself. So don't lick it. And one other curious thing, and this has just gotten on the news again, and this happened last year too, is it found on Mars? And no, nobody's found it yet, but what the spectrometers have suggested is there's sulfate present on Mars, and there's some topographic highs in areas. So it's not huge news, but I'll just show, this is what happened today from the local news. So we didn't even talk to them. They just brought this out. So Mars is definitely a hot topic, of course.
Wow.
Yeah, they say the Mars thing for hype. So it's very common in the North Arm, and it forms as this slush. It's a very hydrated slush, usually on the shores of the North Arm area. You can find it out at Spiral Jetty right now. If you walk out there, wear some muck boots, and you can slush around in there. It is forming in the lake, and what happens is storms blow it over on the leeward side, and it accumulates as these beach bars. And I got a video here of Mike Vandenberg slushing around in it. This is a little more dry because it's not quite in the water, but yeah, when it dries out, it kind of forms this snowy powder. It was also found when they're constructing the causeway. So here's Promontory Point here. There's this big fault line, Promontory Fault. And when they were constructing the causeway, they took several shallow cores and they determined the thickness of what they called quote unquote clobber salt to be all the way up to 35 feet thick, close to the fault. So it's kind of like a sag effect here of the accumulation. And it turned out it was a very stable substrate. So they put the causeway on it, and apparently it's still there today. Oh, and let me back up. So that was pre-1960, so before the causeway was actually built. Okay, so the South Arm Merabilites at the state park, like I said, Allison Thompson noticed these when lake level went down, and all of a sudden she saw these mounds starting to appear. And they're named Mound A through D in order. So this one appeared first, and then she noticed this one popped up, and all of a sudden this one popped up, and then this was the last one that popped up. So they all formed at different rates, different times, starting in the early fall, I think October. And so in April and the spring, when lake level rises, those seeps get totally submerged and dissolved in Merabolite. So maybe these are not as uncommon as we thought because historical lake level highs. So they were the seeps were never exposed to produce the Merabolite at the surface. So they grow at different rates, times. They vary in size, 5 to 20 feet wide and up to 3 feet tall. And changes in hydraulic head create a variety of flow pathways. And what happens is these springs get abandoned with a lot of crystallization, and then all of a sudden there's some type of hydraulic push laterally or northward, and the spring waters start to emerge and precipitate new mounds. So there's chemical and physical processes going on here. There's the flowing phase, which create these micro tear sets here, which are mini rimstone dams. And what those dams do is they have back pools. So think of like the travertine tufa deposits in Yellowstone with the flowstone features there, very similar. And as the water is flowing, basically the precipitation and sometimes sediment gets stuck where the water is flowing, which helps aggregate the crystals with the sediment. And so they make these dams. And the crystals, because they start to grow higher than the back pool, they will precipitate more crystals at the air-water interface. And they're made of these plated tabular crystals that are clear. And you can see in some places there's remnant pooled up brines, and later those will precipitate smaller crystals. So the density is higher than the lake water. Common temperature of groundwater, so about 50, 55 degrees C, neutral, has a really potent sulfur smell coming out of the orifice of these spring seeps. And then there becomes a dehydration phase. So as the hydraulic head changes a little bit, or because the discharge zone gets plugged up with crystals, the mounds basically shut off and they die, unless you pop it with a drill. And basically the crystals turn white into thenardite, and because of dry climate and warming temperatures, they start to dry out. But these are the little tabular crystals, the remnants of the brine in the little pools. So then as the lake level rises and we get storms all the time, they start to fall apart. You get these mushroom structures, so everything's eroding underneath, and then these are just going to fall apart on each other. You get fractures and caverns, and you get a bunch of sediment that gets transported on top. So it just basically storms and high lake level just kill the mounds. There's some biological components. So here's what I was saying: if you pop the pimple, you can actually get it to start releasing brine again, and this is at 5 feet depth, so think of it going all the way down here. And what we recovered was this green algae. Likely, Bonnie, you can help me with this. But when the springs are just seeps themselves, there's a lot of green algae in them. So basically, that is preserved in the core here. And you also get a lot of entombed brine shrimp carcasses and brine fly larvae and some other organics. So it's a cool preservation piece, but if they don't last long, then they don't preserve the organics. So here's just another comparison. During the winter, January, the spring waters are warmer than the lake waters, higher density, same pH, oxidation reduction potential, so that's how reduced or oxidative the water is. It's very negative, whereas the lake water is very oxidative. The sulfur 34 isotope is very positive, and the sulfite content is very high, so that suggests some type of sulfate reducing bacteria is in the water. Brine chemistry we collected from last year too. This is a comparison of North Arm brine, typical chemistry, South Arm brine in blue, and the springs in green. And basically all the other constituents are relatively similar, except if you look at the calcium, it's more elevated, and the sulfate is way more elevated. And then if you evaporate this brine, or if you just take this brine and then you look at its saturation state of different minerals over different temperatures, you do see that Merabolite is at saturation, which is at 1. All the others are undersaturated until about 10 degrees in the dry climate. So the modeling confirms our observations, which is nice. So this is an interesting one. This is from this year with the help of Jamie and Elisa with the cameras. We put temperature transducers in a couple seeps, and this one is from Mounds C, which is one of the biggest ones right now. So in October, it's just a pool. You might have a couple crystals that form at night when the temperature is low. And these temperature reflect the surface water in the brine. So it's mainly a reflectance of air temperature going up and down. So during the day it goes up, night goes down, so on and so forth. Until you start getting into November, you get colder nights, you start forming a lot more crystals, but then they might redissolve during the day when it warms up. And then around November 10th, it really started to excel. And this is when we put a pipe in the ground to protect our temperature probe. And basically what that did was stabilize the temperature because there's no interaction with the air at the common temperature of the groundwater. And then in this spot, a lot of precipitation occurred and just totally disrupted our temperature probe. And so we couldn't collect data. But then when we cleaned it off, we were able to collect data. And now you can see groundwater is typical around 10, and it will drop down during the really, really cold nights that we had in early December. And this is a little video that Jamie made of that spring seep. So this is when it's warm. Keep your eye out for storm events too, which are kind of cool to look at. You can see all the green algae just flourishing in here. You can see the seeps. Oh, there's a crystal that forms. A little more crystals. They're forming more at night, and then during the day, they dissolve. And you can see little dissolution pipes and see this stuff just kind of wick away. But then you start to get bigger crystals, and oh, they disappeared. Let's see. And so we can track this with the date and time and correlate it with the weather patterns. Oh, a little sediment accumulated. Must have had a storm. Oh, a little more sediment. Big storm, snowstorm. So Seiche came in, put all the sediment in here, which is helping agglutinate the crystals as they're forming to create these rims. And so now we're really taking off on the mound formation. So we're actually looking at this vertical succession. For whatever reason, the camera stopped right there. So at night, it seems like now the water is really discharging. And then during the day, you have more intensive crystallization, so it backs off. This was the Seiche. Coated it again with sediment. So now it rebuilds. And you can really just see how the terraces start forming and the pools get filled in with crystals. And so now the spring is up here where it's really discharging. Yeah, so this is how you can observe the stacking patterns of it and the impact that the lake levels have. Okay. Okay, and then this is our other transducer that has conductivity in green, temperature in blue. Same thing, this is Mound D. Mound C is over here. And this one basically got plugged up early December. But you can see as the temperature is decreasing, so is the conductivity, which means you had a lot more crystallization going on with the colder temperatures, which is lowering your solute content in the actual brine. And I would also say that this conduit, the transducer is down about 5 feet. So, and it was easy to put this pipe in the ground. It just slides right through the seep. So there are other Merabolite springs. The Bureau of Mines in the 50s, late 50s, they were looking for a resource, an economic resource of sodium sulfate, and they noticed that here's the marina, this whole mud flat over here, past even Saltaire, they cored a bunch of holes and they found Merabolite up to 6 feet thick in the subsurface in oolitic sands. And so the idea is that before the causeway was built, the north and south arm were probably in equilibrium in regards to saturation state of Merabolite. So this is the leeward side. So anything that's forming, in the water in the south arm at this time gets washed onto the shore from storms or seiches. And then just like in the north arm where you form those beach bars, it accumulates and then settles in the subsurface in the oods. And maybe it dissolves into a sulfate-rich brine, or it is a solid in the subsurface. So when you go out there, you see all these pock marks, little dishes, seep holes. Here's a 4-foot auger that was easy to put in. Here's a drone footage of all the holes. I think one of these are yellow field book. So typically what happens when they dry out, they have crystals. Some are big bladed crystals, some are big. And then the typical thing that you'll see out there, and right now, especially if you look at the mud flat, it's all white because of this wicking effect of capillary force. This brine is coming up to the surface, drying out, and it's making the whole mud flat white. But typically what you'll see are these white crystals as the brine dries out. You are basically dehydrating the crystals. So interpretations, hypothesis, Merabolite's not as common as we thought. It's just the mounds because of historic lake level lows, probably. These low lake levels allow this, along with hydraulic head, allow the sulfate-rich water that comes to the surface. And so with that Bureau of Mines report, it really does make sense that sodium sulfate from the lake was washed onto the shore, dissolved into the subsurface, and now maybe ooids in differential layers that are laterally discontinuous but are hard packed allow the hydraulic head to kind of shift in different areas. We were out here, and when one of these turned off, we witnessed this one just turned right on, and it was actually gushing, which was interesting. Microbial life, perhaps they play a role. Hopefully Eric and Bonnie can add some knowledge to that and interpretations when they get their results back. And implications for Mars, well, time will tell, who knows. But then I want to show you what else is out there on antelope. So very similar features, big and broad. This little pond here, this seep that Eric is taking a DNA sample from is this one. But they're much broader. There's a lot of filamentous sulfur oxidizing bacteria that kind of create these filaments that get blown onto the edges of the ponds. A lot of green algae, maybe it's Dunaliella, don't know. But when you cut open a crystal, look at it under the microscope, there's fluid inclusions which trap the brine, but they also trap a lot of this green algae. So polarized and fluorescent light there. I would say if you guys do go out there, even at the marina, don't walk on them. We're trying to keep them preserved so we can continue our study. And they undergo the same process. This is January. This is the same pond, gets coated with sediment, gets covered up, disappears. Here's dried out crystals, skeletal crystals. Eventually, you'll just see a pile of white dust that eventually gets blown away. So with that, thank you. Questions? This was a team of us that went out there last January, I think. The Merab has attracted many people, even NASA scientists and the general public. So we'll see where this all goes.